Few people know this, but on the last night before his arrest, Jesus shared a hidden teaching that was never intended for the masses. He spoke only to the inner circle, to the disciples who carried something different within them, a divine spark that the common people did not possess. And, before we continue, let me ask you something important. Where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments. You will be surprised at how many awakened people appear when this call is made. This teaching described 3 types of humans: hylic, completely attached to matter; psychics, who seek meaning but live on the border between light and illusion; and the pneumatics, direct fragments of the monad, spiritual beings who came into the world with a mission. This division never appears in public sermons, only in Gnostic cosmology and in texts that speak of the silent confrontation between Jesus and the archons, the guardians of ignorance. And hylics, something that might move you. Jesus said that recognizing this knowledge is already a sign of spiritual awakening. It's no coincidence that you came across this video. Nothing in the search for gnosis, divine origin, liberation from the prison of reincarnation, happens by chance. Synchronicities, deep questions, the feeling of not completely belonging to the world. All of this could be the call that the monad makes to its forgotten children. But before we know who you really are, we need to understand what Jesus revealed that night. And the question he left in the air remains echoing to this day. Are you one of them? That last night before the arrest, as tension hung in the air, Jesus gathered just the inner circle, those he knew possessed something greater than simple spiritual curiosity. He was not there to repeat parables or comfort crowds. It was time to open the hidden teaching reserved for those who carried the divine spark. Can you imagine the weather? The disciples felt that something great was about to be revealed, something that would completely change their view of the divine origin and mission of the soul. And Jesus, with the serenity of someone who sees beyond matter, began to talk about realities that common theology would never touch. He explained that his public teachings were like half-open doors, but deep knowledge that involving Gnostic cosmology, the archons, the demiurge, and the true spiritual structure of the universe was delivered only to those who had the consciousness to receive it. It was not spiritual elitism, but perception. Some were prepared, others were still trapped in the illusion of separation. The Last Supper, often portrayed as a moment of farewell, was actually a moment of activation. There, Jesus spoke of things such as the monad, the eternal spirit, and the return to divine origin. It was content too strong for ears that were still sleeping. As he spoke, Jesus made it clear that his disciples were faced with a choice: awaken or remain in the prison of reincarnation. He knew those words would move them deeply, because they revealed not only what lies above the world, but also what tries to keep them trapped below the systems of the archons and their layers of control. The most intriguing thing is that Jesus did not present spiritual awakening as a theory, but as a direct experience. He wanted them to realize who they really were, before the dense body tried to silence the witnessing consciousness. And that was just the beginning. Jesus knew exactly who he was speaking to and therefore shaped each word according to the conscience of those who heard him. To the crowd, he delivered parables that acted as mirrors to the inner circle. He revealed the hidden teaching that dealt with the divine origin of the soul and the 3 types of humans in the Gnostic vision. He said that the disciples understood because they carried a divine spark, something that could not be explained, only recognized. That night was the perfect time to touch on this point. Their spiritual awakening was maturing. When explaining why he spoke differently to each group, Jesus made it clear that not everyone had the same ability to perceive spiritual reality beyond the veil of matter. He spoke about the hylics, trapped in the physical world, and about the psychics, who searched for meaning but were still confused in the traps of the demiurge. With the pneumatic tires, he could go deep into gnosis, Gnostic cosmology, and the return to the monad. This distinction was not judgment, but recognition of different levels of consciousness. The disciples didn't know it at the time, but Jesus was preparing them for spiritual attacks, intense synchronicities, and signs of awakening that would accompany them from then on. He emphasized that those who had the divine spark perceived the illusion of separation more easily, even when they could not explain why. That realization, sometimes subtle, sometimes overwhelming, was why they were there that night. And, without realizing it, they were already living the mission of the tires, remembering who they are to help others remember too. When Jesus started talking about the 3 types of humans, the atmosphere changed completely. It was no ordinary teaching, it was a key that dismantled the entire structure of material existence. He explained that the hylics were entirely shaped by the archons, rulers of this illusory world. The psychics came from the demiurge, carrying soul and spiritual search, but still trapped in the wheel of reincarnation. And then he revealed the pneumatics, beings whose origin came directly from the monad, the absolute source. This classification was not intended to separate people, but to reveal different levels of consciousness within Gnostic cosmology. The disciples were surprised to realize that this division answered many questions that had always accompanied them. Jesus said that the hylics live immersed in matter, without recognizing anything beyond the visible psychics, on the other hand, search for meaning, feel the presence of something greater, but are unable to completely break the limits imposed by the demiurge. Pneumatics, on the other hand, have carried a mission since before they were born to awaken, remember and return to the divine. Their journey is different because the internal structure itself is different. In presenting this vision, Jesus wanted the disciples to understand not only the world, but themselves. He encouraged them to notice their own signs of awakening synchronicities, strong intuitions, discomfort with control systems, and the deep sense that life is more than the story of the body. These elements were signs of who carries the divine spark of the monad. And so, with just a few words, he opened the door to an understanding that would completely transform the way they saw the purpose of the soul. Jesus taught that nothing related to spiritual awakening happens by chance. If someone is interested in occult teachings, in Gnostic cosmology, in the idea of the three types of humans and in the return to the monad, this already says a lot about their nature. Hylic souls, according to him, cannot connect with this type of content, it simply does not resonate. Therefore, the fact that you are here, watching, reflecting and feeling something vibrate within you, is already an indicator that the divine spark is active. Deep curiosity is often the first sign that the soul is awakening. Many people spend their entire lives without questioning anything, living completely absorbed by matter, distractions, and narratives created by the archons. But when someone feels that there is something beyond, something hidden behind the visible, it is because they no longer belong to that raw state of consciousness. Jesus said that the spiritual seeker does not become a seeker, he awakens to the fact that he always has been. And this awakening begins exactly like this, with an internal call that no one on the outside can explain. This is why Jesus spoke to the inner circle so differently. He knew how to identify who was ready for gnosis and who was still stuck in spiritual sleep. If this content touches you, bothers you, elevates you, or makes something click inside you, it's no coincidence. It's part of the tire journey to recognize what's yours. And recognizing this call is the beginning of a journey that has no return, because once consciousness awakens, it never fully fits into the illusion of separation. Jesus described the hylics as those whose existence is completely rooted in the material world. This is not about judging or belittling anyone, but about recognizing that certain beings were shaped by the archons themselves to keep the cycle of illusion working. These humans live guided by basic impulses, immediate desires, and the logic of seeing is believing. For them, any teaching that talks about monads, gnosis, or spiritual awakening sounds like fantasy. It's like trying to explain the ocean to someone who only knows a glass of water. A clear sign of hylicism is the inability to perceive any reality beyond the body and sensory experiences. They do not reflect on divine origin, soul mission, or witness consciousness. These themes simply do not make sense to those trapped in the density of matter. Jesus did not condemn them, it simply explained that each type of being fulfills its function within Gnostic cosmology. Hylics keep the archon system working, focused on producing emotional energy, conflict and distraction, without noticing what lies beyond. Trying to explain deep spirituality to a hylic is like speaking an unknown language. Even if they listen, they don't understand. Even if they understand, they don't change. Therefore, Jesus did not waste his hidden teachings on them. He said that the hylic does not awaken, it was not created for that. And understanding this difference helps spiritual seekers to stop trying to convince those who do not have the structure to understand. The tires wake up psychics, seek the hylics remain where they are. Jesus explained that psychics live on an interesting frontier. They have a soul, feel the spiritual call, seek purpose and question existence, but they have not yet completely broken the veil imposed by the demiurge. Unlike hylicians, who perceive nothing beyond matter, psychics feel that something greater exists. However, because they depend on external beliefs, rigid rituals, and spiritual intermediaries, they still do not access the divine directly. It's like trying to tune into a spiritual radio station, but with constant hiss. They tend to be people with great sensitivity, interest in spirituality, philosophy, religion, and self-knowledge. They read about consciousness, follow spiritual traditions, and are sincerely dedicated to improving. But they often become trapped in the prison of reincarnation, repeating cycles of search, error, and learning. Jesus said that psychics have the potential to awaken, but they still carry deep doubts and fear of breaking away from systems of control that seem safe. That's why the archons invest so much in keeping them spinning in circles. The path of the psychic involves discernment, learning to differentiate the voice of the soul from the narratives imposed by the demiurge. With practice, silence, and self-inquiry, they begin to access witness consciousness, that internal point that observes without identifying. Here, finally, space for gnosis appears. When a psychic awakens to his true origin, he stops depending on external beliefs and begins to walk towards the monad through direct experience, which brings him closer to the pneumatic condition. The pneumatics are those whose spirit does not originate in the demiurge nor in the archons, but in the monad itself, the absolute source. Jesus explained that these beings did not come into the world by accident, they were sent as volunteers, fragments of the divine spark inserted into matter to bring awareness where illusion reigns. From an early age, they feel that they do not completely belong in this world, as if there is a silent memory of another place. This sensation is not imagination, it is a dormant spiritual memory. Unlike psychics, who seek and learn, pneumatics remember. They have spontaneous flashes of gnosis, powerful intuitions, experiences of unity, and insights that arise without prior study. It's as if something inside them already knows the way. For this reason, they attract synchronicities, intense challenges, and a certain type of resistance from the archon system itself, which tries to keep them trapped in the illusion. Love handlers are uncomfortable not because of rebellion, but because they see beyond the veil. Jesus reinforced that the pneumatics have a clear mission to awaken, remember who they are, and help other fragments to awaken too. When a tire recognizes itself as such, something changes in its internal structure, the witness consciousness strengthens, the illusion of separation begins to weaken, and the return to the monad ceases to be a distant idea, becoming a natural direction. It is not an easy path, but it is an inevitable path for those who carry the divine spark. One of the strongest characteristics of tires is the constant feeling of not fully fitting into this world. Jesus said that this perception is not emotional fragility, but spiritual memory. It is as if the soul holds a silent memory of the monad, an echo of where it really came from. Many describe this as longing for a place they have never seen, a deep longing for something that is not on earth but in divine origin. This longing is not sadness, it's a compass. This feeling tends to appear from an early age, difficulty in understanding social rules, questions about reality, discomfort with superficiality, and a strange certainty that there is something bigger that no one around seems to notice. And the more a person tries to adapt completely to the world, the more they feel like they are betraying themselves. Jesus taught that this is not a defect, it is a sign. Pneumatic tires did not come to fit into the archon system, but to remind us that there is life beyond matter. When the spiritual seeker understands this feeling as a sign and not as a problem, everything changes. Instead of trying to conform to what doesn't make sense, he begins to honor his inner nature. Witness consciousness awakens, the illusion of separation weakens, and the path of return to the monad becomes clearer. The feeling of not belonging turns into understanding I'm not from here, but I'm here for a reason. And this reason is always greater than the ego imagines. Pneumaticians often have spontaneous spiritual experiences, even without practicing advanced techniques or studying occult teachings. Jesus explained that this happens because their soul already has a direct connection with the monad, and at certain times this connection breaks the barrier of matter. It's that moment when everything seems to make sense, as if a veil fell for a few seconds. It can happen during silence, in a deep conversation, or even in common everyday situations. It is gnosis appearing without warning. These moments are marked by a sense of unity, the realization that there is no real separation between you and the rest of creation. Pneumaticians report causeless chills, jolts of energy, symbolic visions, and insights so clear they seem like information downloads. Psychics can have experiences like this, but in psychics they happen in a more intense and natural way, as if something internal was trying to remind them of who they really are. Jesus said that these glimpses are like little windows into the spiritual realm. Recognizing these experiences as part of awakening is essential, because the archon system tries to convince the seeker that this is all imagination. But the more a person pays attention to the witnessing consciousness, the more they realize that these experiences are real and recurring. They serve as beacons amidst the illusion, reminding the pneumatic soul that its origin is not of this world and that return to the monad is not only possible, it is inevitable. These are signs that the awakening is already underway. A striking characteristic of pneumatics is the difficulty in accepting ready-made truths, rigid dogmas, or authorities that say what the person should think or believe. Jesus explained that this is not gratuitous rebellion, it is spiritual memory. The pneumatic soul intuitively recognizes that divine truth cannot be imposed by any demiurge system. It needs to be lived, felt, and confirmed internally through gnosis, and not memorized as a rule. For this reason, many pneumatists have always been seen as questioning. This resistance appears early from school to traditional religious environments. Tires ask why, when everyone accepts just because. They find hierarchical structures strange, avoid leaders who demand submission, and are uncomfortable with speeches that try to control conscience. It's as if there is an internal alarm that goes off whenever an idea is not aligned with the divine spark. This irritates archons and control systems, as a being that thinks for itself is more difficult to manipulate. For Jesus, this spiritual independence was essential. He taught that awakening does not happen through repetition of words, but through internal experience. Pneumaticians only trust what they can prove through witness consciousness, synchronicities, intuitive perceptions, and the spiritual journey itself. As a consequence, they develop a lively, free, and deep spirituality. And, without realizing it, they become a reference for those who are still trapped by the illusion of separation. Jesus taught that tires did not come into the world to accumulate spiritual knowledge just for themselves. They have a silent but powerful mission to awaken other fragments of the monad that have also fallen into oblivion. This mission is not accomplished through forced preaching, but through their own presence, through the way they perceive reality, and through the way they break patterns that the demiurge uses to keep consciences asleep. Pneumatic tires light up paths simply by existing authentically. This task is not always comfortable. Many times, a pneumatic person finds himself surrounded by people who are still tied to matter or to the rigid beliefs imposed by the archons. He feels that he cannot abandon his inner truth, and, at the same time, he realizes that his lucidity bothers those who prefer the illusion of separation. Still, it is precisely this difference that arouses curiosity in others. A phrase, a gesture, an insight shared at the right moment can ignite the spark in someone who was on the verge of awakening. The most fascinating thing is that pneumatic tires do not need to make conscious effort to fulfill this mission. Every encounter is guided, every synchronicity is aligned, and every spiritual experience lived serves as a beacon for another seeker. Jesus explained that when a pneumatic person truly awakens, its light weakens the influence of the surrounding archons, and this creates a domino effect. One awakens another, which awakens another. And thus the memory of divine origin spreads. The mission is collective, even when it seems lonely. Jesus explained that the key to understanding the three types of humans is recognizing the nature of the consciousness that sustains them. Hylics live completely immersed in matter, identified with desires, possessions, and instincts. For them, there is only what they can touch, measure, or consume. Consciousness is so fused with the body that the idea of spirit seems too distant. It's like trying to see stars in the middle of the midday sun. The light of matter overshadows everything. Psychics live on an intermediate level. They have a soul, they feel purpose, they seek meaning and suffer from the feeling that something is missing. They oscillate between light and shadow, between matter and spirit. This is why so many religious traditions speak deeply to this group. They offer structure, explanations, and paths that help, but still do not completely liberate. Jesus said that psychics carry immense potential, but they need to break dependence on external authorities to access direct gnosis. Pneumatics, on the other hand, have a form of consciousness that comes directly from the monad. They don't seek God, they remember Him. That's why they have strong intuitions, deep perceptions, and that strange familiarity with Gnostic teachings, as if they had heard them before. The pneumatic spirit observes life as a witness, without being completely confused with the history of the body. This consciousness is light, expansive, and naturally attracted to the return to the divine. Jesus revealed these differences not to separate, but so that each person would recognize their own origin and purpose. Jesus taught that death is not an end, but a transition, and that this transition occurs completely differently for each type of consciousness. The hylics, attached to matter, remain on the demiurge's wheel, dissolving into what created them. Psychics, with a soul and a spiritual quest, return to the cycle of reincarnation to continue learning, until they finally break the veil. But the pneumatics, if awakened, do not return to this world. They go straight to the monad, the absolute source, where the true divine origin resides. This return does not happen through merit, nor through religious effort, it happens through recognition. Jesus explained that when the pneumatic person abandons the illusion of separation and lives as a witness consciousness, the connection with the material world weakens. He ceases to be attracted by the traps of the archons and the shadows of the demiurge. Instead of being recycled through reincarnation, your spirit vibrates in tune with the source, like a flame that finally returns to the fire from which it came. Many pneumatologists feel this even in their lifetime, that feeling of not coming back from here, as if this existence were a last chapter. They realize that the mission is being fulfilled, that synchronicities increase, and that the search for external answers loses its meaning. Jesus said that when recognition is complete, death becomes a smooth passage, there is no fear, only return. What was a fragment is reintegrated into the whole. And so, the spiritual journey is completed without the need for new cycles. Jesus taught that true awakening is not intellectual but experiential. And the central practice for this is simple yet profound, recognizing yourself as the witnessing consciousness. Instead of fully identifying with thoughts, emotions, and memories, the person's story, the seeker learns to observe all of these as passing phenomena. This change is subtle, but it completely transforms the relationship with the world and with one's own soul. It's like going from actor to spectator of your own internal film. When one begins to practice this recognition, they realize that most suffering arises from excessive identification with the ego, which is the structure that the demiurge uses to maintain the illusion of separation. By observing thoughts rather than being dominated by them, the lover feels an inner space growing. This space is pure presence, the same presence that connects directly to the monad. Jesus said that, in this state, gnosis does not need to be sought, it simply appears. This practice can be done anywhere, while walking, while washing dishes, in the silence before going to sleep. Just remember, what I am is not what I think, but what observes thought. Over time, this anchoring becomes natural. And the more a person lives as a witness, the less they are trapped by the distractions of the archons and the stories that try to define who they are. Returning to the divine begins with this simple recognition: you are not the character, you are the light that illuminates him. Even after great advances in spiritual awakening, Jesus warned that there is a subtle danger: re-identification. In moments of crisis, emotional pain, or deep stress, the seeker can forget his divine nature and return to fully identify with the ego, the character created by the archons to sustain the illusion. It seems that everything that has been understood dissolves, and the person returns to the old pattern of thinking, reacting, and suffering as if they were separate from the monad. This is common, and that's why it's so dangerous. These relapses happen because the ego is intelligent. It uses intense emotions to pull the individual back into density. An argument, a failure, the feeling of rejection. All of this can serve as a trigger. When the seeker forgets to remain a witness consciousness, the external world seems to gain disproportionate weight, and identification with personal history becomes irresistible. Jesus said that these moments do not mean defeat, but testing, an opportunity to reinforce recognition. The secret is to notice the signs of re-identification: early racing thoughts, need for control, sudden fear, feeling of tightness in the chest, desire to flee or fight. When the pneumatician identifies these signs, he or she can quickly return to the practice of internal silence, observation, and conscious breathing. Thus, the bond with the ego weakens and the memory of the divine origin returns. Jesus always emphasized falling is not the problem, remaining asleep is. Awakening is an ongoing process of remembering and remembering again. Jesus warned that the path to spiritual awakening is full of subtle traps, especially for those who have already had experiences of gnosis. One of the most common is spiritual bypassing, when a person uses spirituality to avoid emotions, internal conflicts, or human responsibilities. Instead of healing, she runs away. Instead of observing, she hides behind pretty phrases. This mechanism is dangerous because it creates a false sense of evolution, while the ego continues to be active behind the scenes, fed by the archons. Another pitfall is isolation. Many love handlers, upon realizing that they think and feel differently than most, tend to withdraw from the world. But Jesus reinforced that the objective is not to abandon earthly life, but to live it consciously. Excessive isolation weakens presence and makes the seeker more vulnerable to spiritual attacks, as it reduces external references and increases negative internal dialogue. An awakened tyre needs to find a balanced way of being in the world without being of the world. The third trap is to go back to believing that it is just the body, a classic trick of the archons. They use tiredness, dense routines, and emotional tensions to convince the seeker that their spiritual reality was imagination. Jesus taught that this return to a materialistic view is a temporary regression and should not be a reason for blame. The important thing is to quickly remember, I am more than this. When the individual regains witness consciousness, the illusion loses strength and the journey continues. When pneumatic energy begins to awaken, life changes rhythm and texture. Jesus explained that pneumatic activation is not theory, it manifests itself in clear and sometimes even disturbing ways. One of the first signs is synchronicities, events that seem coincidental but happen in perfect sequence, as if the universe was organizing everything so that you realize the truth. People, messages, and situations appear at the exact moment you need them. None of this is random, it's the monad calling. Another notable sign is meeting other tyres. Suddenly, you cross paths with people who speak the same spiritual language, even without having ever studied Gnostic teachings. There is a feeling of immediate recognition, like old reunions. Furthermore, the famous information downloads emerge, deep insights, ready-made ideas, understandings that arrive complete, without logical reasoning. Jesus said this is spiritual memory opening up, allowing gnosis to flow effortlessly. But along with these light signals also come attacks from the archons. When a tyre awakens, the control system attempts to bring it back to spiritual sleep. This can manifest as sudden anxiety, unexpected conflicts, extreme tiredness, or even a feeling of pressure in the chest. At the same time, an energetic activation occurs: heat, vibrations, goosebumps, intense dreams. This is all part of the transition. The important thing is to remember, if it's happening, it's because the light inside you is growing, and this bothers those who live in darkness. Jesus explained that archons are not visible monsters, but subtle forces that operate in the human psyche to keep consciousness imprisoned. They did not create the spirit, but they created the system that tries to imprison it: fear, conflict, distractions, and illusions. Its objective is simple: to prevent the awakened soul from returning to the monad. Therefore, the archons invest heavily in keeping the seeker emotionally reactive, mentally confused, and spiritually disconnected. Every time someone forgets who they are, their system strengthens. These entities feed on what many call lush, the emotional energy produced through suffering, anxiety, and chaos. This is why pneumatics, upon awakening, begin to notice that certain conflicts seem to appear out of nowhere, as if something is trying to pull them back into density. Jesus said that this is not punishment, it is a natural reaction of a system that feels when it is losing control. The more light a tyre emanates, the more the system tries to surround you with emotional noise. The way to defeat the archons is not to fight them, but to not provide the energy they try to extract. Remaining as a witness consciousness, observing without identifying yourself, and recognizing emotional traps are essential practices. When the tyre does not react with fear or despair, the attack loses power. Jesus taught that spiritual awakening is like turning off the battery that powers the archon system. Little by little, the seeker realizes nothing can touch those who know where they came from and where they are returning. Jesus taught that spiritual protection lies not in external rituals, but in constant remembrance of one's own nature. The greatest danger for the pneumatic is not a visible attack, but the return to spiritual sleep, that state in which the person returns to believing that they are just their body, their mind, and their personal history. To avoid this, he recommended a simple but transformative practice: relaxed vigilance. It is not tense vigilance of someone who expects danger, but a soft, living presence, aware of what appears and disappears internally. One of the most powerful tools is the question, what am I? Not who I am, because that refers to the ego, but what I am. Each time the mind becomes lost in drama, worry, or dense emotion, this question pulls the seeker back into witnessing consciousness. Jesus taught that when you establish yourself in this inner place, nothing external can capture your energy or drag you into the illusions of the archons. This practice dissolves fears, stabilizes emotions, and completely weakens the influence of the demiurge. Another way to avoid spiritual sleep is to maintain small anchors of presence throughout the day: a moment of silence upon waking, conscious breaths before difficult decisions, observing the body from within, noticing thoughts without following them. These simple gestures are like chinks of light in the armor of illusion. The more the seeker does this, the more he realizes that material reality does not have dominion over those who have already recognized its origin. Remaining as consciousness is, at the same time, protection, path, and liberation. Jesus taught that awakening is not just individual, it is collective. Each tire that awakens weakens the archon system, as if removing an essential piece of the gear that keeps the illusion running. When many begin to remember their divine origin, the entire structure built by the demiurge loses meaning. It's like turning on lights in a dark room. The darkness doesn't fight, it just disappears. This is the final calling of the monad, gathering its fragments back into unity. This collective movement explains why so many people around the world are awakening at the same time. Synchronicities increase, intuitions become stronger, and the sense of mission intensifies. Jesus said that when a tire recognizes itself, it becomes a beacon for others, and this speeds up the process for all spiritual humanity. The archon system knows this, which is why it intensifies distractions, conflicts, and emotional noise. But none of this stops the inevitable. The light that remembers where it came from always finds its way back. The decisive point of this call is simple: the farm ends when the awakened remember who they are. There is no need to destroy anything, fight anything, or overthrow any external force. Just recognize your own nature and remain as consciousness. When tires live off the divine spark, the game of illusion loses players. The return to the monad stops being a distant promise and becomes a living process happening within each awakening soul. And when many awaken at the same time, the system naturally collapses due to lack of energy to maintain it. If you've made it this far, you've already realized that none of this is just theory, it's a mirror to your own journey. Every teaching of Jesus about the hylic, psychic, and pneumatic was not meant to create division, but to reveal paths. Paths that you may already be walking without realizing it, guided by synchronicities, deep questions, and that silent feeling that there is something bigger calling your name. The question now is simple: what are you going to do with this calling? Ask yourself, what signs of my own pneumatic activation have I ignored? How much have I lived as a conscience and not as a character? What inside me still believes in the illusions of the archons? These answers don't need to come immediately. You just need to maintain gentle vigilance. Remember the question, what am I? And allow Gnosis to reveal the rest in its time. Awakening is a process, not a goal. If this content touched something inside you, if it sparked a memory, brought clarity, or reinforced the path, then consider it another synchronicity. Stay here with us, because this channel exists for exactly that: remembering who you are. Sign up, turn on notifications, and walk with me through the next chapters of this journey back to the monad. The collective awakening has begun, and you are part of it.